All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know it's been a long day. Thank you for hanging in with us today. We'll have another long day tomorrow. Just a lot of information in a short period of time. If you were taking a forages class at a university, you would spend a semester studying about different forage species. We're not going to do that in a 2-day grazing school, right? So what I'm going to give you is an overview in 30 minutes of some of the primary forage species. If you have questions on other species, just pull us aside and ask your questions about other species. Brittany, could you turn the lights down back there? So we're going to talk about forage species this afternoon from the viewpoint of putting together a comprehensive grazing system. How can we fit these species together to provide the most grazing days per year is our ultimate goal. My email and phone number are on this slide, so if you guys have questions, please feel free to call me if you have questions. If I don't answer the phone, just call back again. Don't leave a message, or you can shoot me an email. This is a partial list. There's even more forage species than this that are available for grazing systems in Kentucky. And you can see there's a lot on this slide. Don't worry, I know it's almost 4:30 and you guys want to go home. We're not going to go over all these tonight. We're just going to go over just a few of them, and we're going to touch on the high points of these few species that are highlighted here. So in general, if we divide our grasses into two distinct categories, we can divide them into what we call our cool season grasses or our warm season grasses. Our cool season grasses are going to have optimal photosynthesis in the leaf blade of the grass at around a temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That means they're going to grow best in the spring and the fall, and they're going to include things like bluegrass, and we have some examples up here. We've got some fescues, is a good example of our cool season grass. It's our best adapted cool season grass. Bluegrass, orchardgrass is another good example of a cool season grass. They're going to have the longest total growing season in Kentucky. They tend to be more digestible and higher in crude protein than our warm season grasses. And that's kind of our second category. If we have these two broad groups, our cool season grasses that grow in the spring and the fall, and our warm season grasses, which tend to grow during the summer months. They're going to have optimal photosynthesis in the leaf blade of a warm season grass plant around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the middle of the summer, if it gets really warm, our warm season grasses become very inefficient at carrying out our cool season grasses become very inefficient at carrying out photosynthesis. In contrast, our warm season grasses, which evolved from cool season grasses to get around this problem of inefficiency in photosynthesis during the summer months, they have optimal growth around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're going to be really cranking along during the summer months, given that they have adequate water. They tend to be more drought tolerant and more efficient at using water in the summer months. Our warm season grass will produce about twice as much dry matter per unit of water used during the summer months compared to a cool season grass. They also tend to be a little bit lower in digestibility and have a little bit lower crude protein concentration. This is just a nice graphic of a cool and a warm season grass. This was taken in March. This is tall fescue. It's up, growing, and cranking along. This is Bermuda grass. It's not dead. It's a warm season grass. It just hasn't started to grow yet. It's not going to start to grow until we get into May and June and really have optimal growth during late June, July, and August. And then as things start to cool down again in September, the Bermuda grass growth will start to slow down again. And tall fescue will pick back up. Alfalfa is right here in the corner. It kind of behaves as an intermediate species. It grows pretty well during the summer months. It has a deep tap root that gives it good drought tolerance. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So this is a typical growth curve for tall fescue and ladino mixture. Tall fescue is our primary pasture grass in the transition zone. And transition zone includes states like Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, southern Indiana, southern Ohio, Missouri. So these states that are kind of tucked between the northern states and the southern states are what we call the transition zone states. This is by far our best adapted cool season grass. We've got a hump of growth in the spring, and then as it gets warm in the summer months, our growth rate decreases significantly, and then it increases with a secondary hump of growth in the fall as things start to cool down and they start to grow again this time of the year. Now, in contrast, our warm season grasses, and this is just a growth curve from a summer annual grass, are going to concentrate most of their growth during June, July, and August, and then it starts to trail off as we get into September. You can see when you overlap these two growth curves how they can complement each other within the grazing system, right? So when our cool season grasses aren't growing very well, if we have a small acreage of summer annual grasses, that can provide grazing, high quality grazing during the summer months.
Just a question on that.
Sure.
Just using your finger, I guess, to trace that a little bit, where does alfalfa fit in as far as its growth pattern in that?
It would be more like this. So it's going to have some growth during the summer months, probably not as much as a summer grass, but yeah. It kind of behaves as an intermediate species between a cool season and a warm season grass. Okay, I want to start out and talk about tall fescue. This is by far the best adapted cool season grass we have here. As much as we moan and complain about Kentucky 31 and tall fescue toxicosis, the simple fact of the matter is this grass has weaned more calves in transition zone states than any other grass. We need to be thinking about how do we use this grass optimally within a grazing system. And it starts out by thinking about what's positive about this grass and how do we manage it to capitalize on those positive characteristics. And we really need to focus on management. So we need to do things like thinking about how do we optimize growth by managing soil fertility. How do we reduce tall fescue toxicosis by including legumes in our tall fescue pastures? If you're not familiar with tall fescue toxicosis, tall fescue that just occurs naturally in most pastures in Kentucky has what we call an endophyte in it. An endophyte is a fungus that kind of lives between the plant cells. And that endophyte plant combination causes a compound called ergovaline to be produced, and that ergovaline causes livestock disorder called tall fescue toxicosis. Essentially what's happening is the ergot alkaloids or the ergovaline in tall fescue cause the vascular system of the animal to get smaller or constrict. And the way a cow cools itself during the summer months is that it pumps blood to the skin surface and that heat radiates off the skin surface. When that vascular system is smaller, it can't pump blood efficiently to the skin surface to cool itself. So essentially what happens during the summer months is that it's running a low-grade fever during the summer, so it doesn't feel well. It eats less and productivity declines. And that costs the cattle industry about $1 billion per year. Okay, and there's some novel approaches that we'll talk about to relieving tall fescue. And one of those approaches is to dilute the tall fescue in the pastures. We do that by managing for legumes in that grazing system. So red clover and white clover are an important part of that grazing system. We can incorporate a novel endophyte tall fescue. That's a tall fescue that has an endophyte, but it doesn't produce those toxins associated with lower animal performance. Probably one of the biggest and most underutilized attributes of tall fescue is its ability to be stockpiled for winter grazing. Of all the forage species that we have in Kentucky, tall fescue is by far the best forage species to be stockpiled for winter grazing. We can pull animals off in late summer, usually the third week of July, and then add a little bit of nitrogen to that pasture. If we get some rain, we're going to produce a tremendous amount of growth as we get into late August, September, October, and November. And then we can start to ration that forage back out to those animals as we get around December 1st. We give them a small portion of that tall fescue at a time, and then that reduces the amount of hay that we need within our grazing system. Winter feed is probably the most expensive component of grazing systems. So if we can, anything we can do to allow those animals to harvest more of their own forage during the winter months is going to increase the profitability of a grazing system. And stockpiling is one of those major practices, and tall fescue is the grass to stockpile. Other grasses can be stockpiled, but tall fescue by far holds its forage quality as we get into January and February much better than other cool season grasses. This is actually taken on this February 10th. The crude protein in this stockpiled tall fescue underneath the snow was 16% and the TDN was 60%. Those numbers probably don't mean a lot to you right now, but 16% crude protein is going to meet the needs of a lactating brood cow, and 60% TDN is going to meet her energy requirements. And that's important because most of the hay that we're feeding during the summer months will not be this high in forage quality. It's going to be 55% TDN or lower, and usually crude protein will run around 10 to 11%. So one of the big attributes of stockpiled tall fescue is its ability to maintain that forage quality, which will almost always be higher than most of the hay that we feed during the winter months. Okay, change gears a little bit and talk about orchard grass. Orchard grass is probably one of my favorite cool season grasses. It's a bunch type grass, so it kind of grows in clumps, and a sod is a lot of those clumps really close together. As it starts to thin out, we'll form what we call an open sod, so some of the clumps die, we'll start to see space between those clumps. The one thing that orchard grass doesn't tolerate real well is close and frequent defoliation. Whether it's grazing or whether it's with a disc spine, if we're cutting it close or grazing it close and we're doing that frequently, orchard grass is not going to survive under that type of management as well as tall fescue will. So because of this, it has, it kind of behaves as a short-lived perennial within grazing and haying systems. So if an orchard grass stand lasts 3 or 4 years, then you've done fairly well with that orchard grass stand. It's got some disease and insect problems. Its biggest fit is for horse hay. It's a good fit for horse hay. Some varieties are slightly more persistent than others, but overall, at the end of the day, orchard grass is still orchard grass, and it's not going to be quite as well adapted to Kentucky as tall fescue is. Talk about alfalfa. We often call it the queen of the forages. I sometimes call it the pouty princess, and I'll tell you why I say that. Alfalfa is a great forage crop. There's no question about it. Productive. It forms that symbiotic dinitrogen relationship with rhizobium bacteria. It's where it fixes its own nitrogen from the air. It's a long-lived perennial. It's got a deep taproot, as we saw today as we were coming back from the farm. We saw some stands of alfalfa that were still green when our cool season grasses were not green. That's due to that deep taproot. It has the ability to find water deeper in the soil profile that our cool season grasses can't. Most of our root system in a cool season grass will be in that upper 8 to 10 inches of soil, so about 80 to 90% of the roots will be in that top part of the soil. Alfalfa can go 4 or 6 or even deeper feet into the soil. And that gives it the ability to capture water deeper in the soil profile, giving it good drought tolerance. It's an aggressive nitrogen fixer, 150 to 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. Now, the reason I call it the pouty princess sometimes is that it has some really specific soil requirements. It has to have a deep, well-drained, fertile soil. If you've got an eroded hillside or a soil with a fragipan like Dr. Grove was talking about this morning, or a soil that's really low in fertility or low in pH, alfalfa is not a good fit there. Or a river bottom. The one thing it can't really stand is wet feet. So it's got to have the ability for water to drain away from its root system to be persistent. Can be used for grazing. If it's used for grazing, it has to be rotationally stocked because of the way it grows. When you graze an alfalfa plant off, it regrows. As it regrows, it uses stored energy in its root system. And you have to give that plant time to restore that energy to the root system between grazing events. Generally, that will be somewhere around 28 to 35 day grazing cycle. So it has to be rotationally stocked. It can cause bloat. So ideally, to reduce the chances of frothy bloat with alfalfa, we'd want to mix it with a grass. to dilute some of the alfalfa and reduce our chances of bloat. Red clover is one of our legumes that we're kind of rediscovering, and it's a short-lived perennial. It's probably one of our most important pasture legumes because it's really easy to frost seed. We'll talk about frost seeding in more detail tomorrow, but essentially that's when we broadcast that seed onto a closely grazed pasture in February, allowing the freezing and thawing cycles to incorporate that seed into the soil surface. It's a short-lived perennial. Now, when we select improved varieties, we're going to get another year out of those improved varieties. If we just go to the farm store and get a medium red clover, variety not stated, we're going to get 1 to 2 years out of that. If we get an improved variety, we'll get 2 to 3 years out of that improved variety. If you want to buy, probably one of our best red clover varieties is an old one called Kenland. Now, Kenland can be bought either a certified seed, which has a blue tag on it, or just Kenland not certified. If you buy Kenland seed, make sure you get certified seed. When you get certified seed, it guarantees that that is Kenland in that bag. If I buy Kenland that is not certified, it could really be anything in that seed, any type of medium red clover. It's got good drought tolerance, not as good as alfalfa, excellent seedling vigor, making it easily established by frost seeding, and then again, use certified seed. Now, one of the things that we're discovering with red clover is that it has some properties that may help to relieve tall fescue toxicosis. So it has a set of compounds called isoflavones in the red clover, and our USDA pasture research unit is doing extensive work with red clover. Essentially, the isoflavones act as a vasodilator in the animal. So when the animal eats red clover, those isoflavones cause the vascular system to enlarge where the ergovalines cause it to shrink. So it reverses the negative impact of tall fescue within grazing systems. And they're doing some novel work with incorporating red clover leaves into minerals to help with tall fescue toxicosis.
Is crimson clover comparable?
You know, I don't know the answer to that for sure, whether it's
Yesterday, there was nothing that had the levels of red clover. White clover has about a 20th of the amount of isoflavones, but still can have some benefit if it's a decent amount of the pasture. I'll follow up on crimson, but I don't think any are close to red clover.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to talk about white clover. This is another important pasture legume in Kentucky. And there's 3 types of white clover. We kind of always think of it as just one type, but we really have 3 distinct types. We have a small or a Dutch white clover, a medium, and then a larger ladino white clover. And generally we recommend when you overseed or frost seed into a pasture that you use the ladino or large type. It's going to produce about 3 to 5 times as much dry matter as the small Dutch white clover, so it's much more productive. It has a structure called stolons. A stolon is a modified stem that grows along the soil surface. So it's white clover is kind of a neat plant to have in a pasture that may be a little bit thin because it's going to fill in. It's going to spread out and fill in between those plants where there's nothing growing. And everywhere where there's a node on the stem, it can put a new root system down. So it's nice to have in a mixture. It doesn't have great drought tolerance because it doesn't have a real defined deep taproot system like alfalfa or red clover would have. Now, the one thing that is a big advantage of white clover is it's extremely high in forage quality. When the animals graze a white clover plant, all they're getting is leaf in this little structure here called a petiole. It's not really a stem. The stem is growing along the soil surface. So what they're getting is mostly leaf tissue, and it's very high in forage quality. So generally, when we overseed a pasture during frost seeding, we would recommend 6 to 8 pounds of red clover and 1 to 2 pounds of a ladino or white clover in that mixture. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow during the pasture renovation talk. Annual lespedeza. Greg talked about this at his farm when we visited his farm this afternoon. This is a warm season annual legume. That means it has to come back from seed every year. Sometimes annual lespedeza will produce seed, but it doesn't do it reliably. So generally speaking, if you want annual lespedeza, you're probably going to have to frost seed it each year. It's a warm season annual non-bloating legume. It's tolerant to lower fertility and lower pH. So 50 or 60 years ago, quite a bit of annual lespedeza was used before people had better access to lime and fertilizer. As we had better access to lime and fertilizer, we were able to create an environment in which red clover and white clover are much more prolific than annual lespedeza. Now, if you have a farm that you're renting and the fertility is not perfect on that farm, and you want something to frost seed onto that farm, annual lespedeza may be a good choice if you can't afford to make that investment on rented land in terms of lime and fertilizer. Two types, a Kobe type and a Korean type. Generally speaking, we recommend the Korean type. It tends to be higher in productivity than the Kobe types. This last year, we tried to buy some varieties for a variety test of annual lespedeza, and we could not get any varieties. So most of the seed out there right now is going to be variety not stated. We did some trial work in Virginia with variety not stated Korean lespedeza, and it was the highest yielder in the trial. So if you can just get a Korean lespedeza, that's probably what you're going to be able to get your hands on. Go ahead.
Another lespedeza, the cuniata, I'm not sure how to say it, but we call it Chinese clover. Do you have any idea how it compares?
So would that be Sericea lespedeza? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, I think. So I wanted to mention Sericea lespedeza. This is the only perennial warm season legume that we have that's adapted to Kentucky. And we find this commonly in low fertility areas, so road cuts where the soil's not ideal, reclaimed mine land, or where we have real low fertility in pastures. We'll find Sericea lespedeza. It's a long-lived perennial warm season non-bloating legume. It's well adapted to transition zone states like Kentucky. Extremely drought tolerant, tolerant of acid soils and lower fertility, although it will respond yield-wise to improved fertility. There's several cultivars available, but really only one that you can purchase, and that would be AU Grazer from was developed at Auburn University. It's kind of medium in tannin level. Tannin is a compound that we find in Sericea lespedeza that makes it not as palatable to the animal. It makes it kind of bitter tasting. Has to be rotationally stocked, has poor seedling vigor. Where does Sericea fit into grazing systems at? This is probably not something I would tell you to go out and plant. But if you have reclaimed mine land or you have bought an old farm that's kind of been neglected, you may have it. And you may have to start to manage it. So the best management practice is to keep it below your knee. If you can keep it grazed down or clip it when it gives above your knee, you're going to increase the palatability of it. Once it gets up to your belly button, then it's gone too far and the palatability is going to be extremely low. One good fit is small ruminants. It has some natural deworming effects for small ruminants, and goats especially tend to like Sericea lespedeza for some reason. So not your first choice, but if you've got it, then you need to start to think about how do I use it on my farm. Just wanted to mention Bermuda grass, and we see more and more Bermuda grass kind of creeping into Kentucky. Bermuda grass is a perennial warm season grass. It's well adapted to transition zone states like Kentucky, especially in the southern western part of the state. Relatively little's been planted in the past. In the past, improved Bermuda grass varieties had to be vegetatively established. So that means I had to dig a piece of Bermuda grass up from a field and bring it up and transplant it into another field. There has been the development of seeded Bermuda grass types with increased cold tolerance. We have a trial of 3 Bermuda grass varieties on a farm in western Kentucky, and all 3 varieties look very good. This is the first summer they've gone through. And so we're pretty excited about that. You can purchase seeded Bermuda grass as either a cultivar or a blend of seed. And a cultivar would be one pure variety in a bag. A blend may be 1 or 2 or 3 varieties in a bag. The bad part about the blends is that they give them a fancy trade name like Ranchero Frio, and then the varieties they put into that particular blend can vary from year to year. So one year you may get variety A and C, the next year you may get B and D. So, but the trade name stays the same, so it's a little deceptive. You have to be very careful. On the seed tag, it should list what the actual varieties are in that particular blend. Avoid blends that contain giant Bermuda grass or common Arizona common Bermuda grass. Those do not have the cold tolerance needed to persist during the winter months in Kentucky. I just put this in. This is the yield response of a seeded Bermuda grass. So this is increasing nitrogen rate 0 to 600 pounds. And then this is the yield. And as you can see, as nitrogen rate increases, yield increases. The reason I put this in here is I want you to realize that if you use Bermuda grass, you're making a commitment to use some commercial fertilizer because it really needs some nitrogen to be productive, even within a grazing system. If you're making a hay system and you're removing 6 tons of dry matter, you're also removing around 80 pounds of P2O5 or phosphorus, and you're removing somewhere around 300 pounds of potash. Those have to be replaced over time. If you don't replace those, you're going to draw soil fertility down, and the Bermuda grass will become less and less productive. This is one of my favorite warm season grasses, and people look at me like I'm crazy, but crabgrass is commonly a weed in row crops and commonly a weed in your wife's flowers, but it can actually be a pretty good forage. Well adapted to this whole Mid-South region. It's an annual that acts like a perennial, so it is a true summer annual. It has to come back from seed every year, but it's a prolific self-reseeder. So it's going to produce its next year's crop this fall and drop that seed onto the soil surface. And with a little bit of tillage or dragging that soil, we can incorporate that seed and it'll come back and produce another crop next year. Best used as a double crop with the winter annual. So annual ryegrass, small grain would be probably the best winter annuals to double crop it with. So this time of year, it's kind of playing out. You would come in, interseed a small grain or annual ryegrass into it. And that would provide you some grazing in the fall, considerable grazing in the spring, and then as that winter annual is playing out in June, the crabgrass is germinating and coming back. This can be a good choice to overseed thin pastures with, and it will provide you some summer grazing. Good yield potential, not as good as Bermuda grass, but excellent forage quality. That's kind of where it really excels at. No prussic acid, can accumulate nitrates under very heavy nitrogen fertilization. So this is, believe it or not, this is 60 days after seeding Red River crabgrass. And this is an approved crabgrass variety. There's about a half a dozen crabgrass varieties out there, and it's been bred for more upright growth and higher dry matter production.
Where was that field at?
This was in the southern Piedmont region of Virginia.
David, how much nitrogen, Chris?
This was a nitrogen trial, so 0 to around 200 pounds of nitrogen at planting. So this was the data. This was total seasonal nitrogen, and the reason I put this up here, not to harp on nitrogen, but crabgrass, like other summer annuals, is going to need a little bit of nitrogen to respond. So when you plant a summer annual like a sorghum Sudan grass or a pearl millet or a crabgrass, you're making a commitment to put some nitrogen on that plant so that you'll get reasonable amount of production. Top production was the 305 pounds of nitrogen. Don't put that much on. You want to be down here on the straight part of the curve, so you're going to be in that range of 100 to 150 pounds applied as a split application. Forage quality is where crabgrass really excels. 75 to 90% digestible. Crude protein, usually in season 10 to 14% depending on nitrogen fertilization. Average daily gains, this is some work from R.L. Dalrymple at the Noble Foundation. With good or medium quality crabgrass, you're looking at about a 1.8 to 2 pounds a day. Average daily gains, unsupplemented for stocker calves. Okay. So I wanted to mention Johnsongrass, and Johnsongrass, commonly considered a weed, especially by our row crop friends. But we're seeing more and more Johnsongrass, and we need to be thinking about how does it fit into a grazing system, or does it fit in at all? And Johnsongrass is a sorghum species, but it's a perennial that spreads via seed and rhizomes. Commonly found on old dairies and bottomland, thrives under hay management. Johnsongrass likes to be defoliated and rested. Where we don't commonly find Johnsongrass is in permanent pasture. So if we have a permanent pasture that's continuously stocked, animals will graze Johnsongrass out because it's very palatable. Now, if we've got a hayfield where we cut it and then we let it rest for a month and cut it again, Johnsongrass thrives under that type of management. Response to nitrogen fertilization can be good forage quality if it's managed. Now, if you let the Johnsongrass get this tall, fully seeded out, the quality is going to be low. Any forage plant is going to be low. But if you're cutting it when it's 30 to 40 inches tall and giving it a chance to rest, you're going to make some pretty high quality hay during the summer months. Okay, one thing to be careful of with Johnsongrass as we get into this time of the year and we start seeing first frost, we can have something occur called prussic acid poisoning. That's when the cells rupture in the plant due to that freezing. And precursors come together to form prussic acid or hydrogen cyanide. That happens in all of our forage species, sorghum Sudan grass, forage sorghum, and Johnsongrass. And when that happens, we can't graze that forage. So the best management practice would be if you have pastures that are infested with Johnsongrass that you're utilizing, pull those animals out of those pastures until frost has occurred and that plant is dried down. I just threw this on here to show you the nutritive value of Johnsongrass. This was from an article from the Noble Foundation in Oklahoma. They ranked top 10 grasses in nutritive quality. On the top of it was Johnsongrass. So it's not necessarily bad quality if it's managed. I just want to mention the sorghum Sudan grass and pearl millet species. Sorghum Sudan grass, of course, is a sorghum species that's an annual, so it has to be reestablished from seed each year. It does not reseed itself. And pearl millet is another summer annual that's established from seed annually. Probably the best producing would be a sorghum species. Pearl millet has no prussic acid, which is a positive, but it's not as productive as sorghum Sudan grass. Just wanted to show you the yield from the first harvest. These were some selected varieties. Big range in yield, 37 to 6,800 pounds. Big range in digestibility, 54 to 74%. The higher the digestibility, the better, the more energy the animal is going to be able to extract from that plant. Sorghum plants that tend to be higher in forage quality are going to have a trait called the brown midrib, and that's a trait that's a phenotypic, this brown midrib is a phenotypic expression of something that's different inside that plant. And what's different is that it has lower levels of a compound called lignin. Lignin causes plant fiber to be less digestible in the rumen of the animal. So when I use brown midrib trait varieties, in general, we're going to see increased digestibility, and that's what this graph shows. Almost done, Ray. 2 slides. Just wanted to mention small grains. They're commonly used. That's a winter annual grass. We commonly think of them as something like wheat that we would harvest for grain, but these can be grazed, ensiled, or cut for hay. And we have several different ones. They're all adapted statewide. They can be grazed, ensiled, or hayed. Double crop with summer annuals like crabgrass or sorghum Sudan grass. Wheat's probably our most versatile. If the prices are good, we could let it fertilize it and let it finish out and harvest it as actually as a grain crop if the economics were there. Rye, cereal rye is going to be the least exacting in soil, in terms of soil requirements in our earliest maturing. We've got barley, but barley is really kind of sensitive to soil. You got to have deep, well-drained, fertile soils. And then winter oats. And winter oats are palatable, but they often don't survive the winter here. About half the winters they're going to winter kill. So they can produce a lot of forage in the fall, but usually they won't make it all the way through the winter. Last one I want to mention is annual ryegrass. This is probably my favorite winter annual grass. High yielding, excellent forage quality. It's extremely lush, can be hay grazed or ensiled. Regrows after cutting until June. That's a big difference between a small grain. Once a small grain joints and the seed head moves up in that stem, when I cut that small grain off, there's not going to be much regrowth. Annual ryegrass is different. So I can cut it, and then it's going to regrow, and it's going to keep doing that in the spring. Cut it or graze it. It's going to keep regrowing in the spring until high temperatures limits growth, and that happens in early to mid-June in most cases. Very consistent production, well adapted to a wide range of soils. Does require some nitrogen fertilization. And make sure you choose a variety that has good cold tolerance. Now, one thing I'll mention about annual ryegrass is that it can be a serious weed in small grain. So if you have a field that you're producing small grains for grain, don't plant it in that field. If you have a neighbor that has small grains for grain, don't be throwing seed onto a small grain field that's beside your pasture. Just be a good neighbor with it. This is just some long-term data from our variety trials here in Kentucky. And as you can see, we've got a range of around 4.5 tons to 3.5 tons long-term over multiple years for some of these varieties. So it can be very productive in forage systems. I'm going to end with this slide, kind of putting everything together. Our goal in Kentucky is probably not to graze 365 days a year, but probably graze 300 days a year. That's what our economists tell us is going to be the most economical. And this is a potential system for transition zone states like Kentucky. So we start with a tall fescue base. We've got a hump of growth in the spring, hump of growth in the fall, not much going on in the summertime. First thing we can do is stockpile that secondary growth in the fall, and that's going to give us extended grazing into the winter months. We can add a sorghum Sudan grass or a crabgrass in the summertime. That's going to fill in this summer slump. And then add annual ryegrass where we have the sorghum Sudan grass at, and fill in a couple more gaps in this system. Now look, I don't live in a fantasy world. It's a lot easier to do this on a slide than it is in the real world. The point that I want to make is that we have a lot of different forage species that we can use in a grazing system. And as our grazing systems evolve and we want to fine tune them, we can add some of these species to extend the grazing from maybe 200 to 250 or 300 days per year.